So continuing, it's now my honor to introduce Scott Sheffield, the CEO of Pioneer Natural Resources, to continue the story of the technological innovation of what we call fracking sometimes. Scott is an energy industry leader who played a significant role in American shale revolution and lifting of the U.S. crude oil export ban. He currently serves as president and CEO of Pioneer Natural Resources, the company he helped found in 1997, and he grew into what is today the second largest crude producer in Texas. The Permian Basin Petroleum Association recently honored Sheffield as a recipient of the prestigious Top Hand Award, which recognizes individuals who have demonstrated exceptional leadership within the oil and gas industry and the Permian Basin community. Please welcome Scott Sheffield.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thanks. Good morning. It's great to be here and be invited to speak about one of my favorite topics. I'm going to sort of migrate. You heard Todd and Lauren talk about the gas shale revolution. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but mostly about the oil shale revolution. And the oil shale revolution followed what Todd's father, George Mitchell, did in the Barnett with the gas shale revolution. If you don't know about Pioneer, Pioneer is about a $28 billion company. We only have one asset. It surrounds Midland, Texas. And I get a chance to speak around the world and educate people over the last several years about the shale revolution in this country. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what it has meant for this country, the shale revolution, and what it's done in regard to job creation, deficits, and other things. First of all, people that don't know about the Permian Basin, I'll have a map in a second, but it covers West Texas, about 25% in southeast New Mexico and 75% in West Texas. What's amazing to me is that the Permian Basin is now the largest oil field in the world. It surpassed Saudi Arabia's Ghawar field over the last 12 to 18 months in Saudi Arabia. So we're producing 4.8 million barrels of oil per day. Expected, you'll see in a minute, to climb on up to about 6 million barrels of oil per day. That's what's amazing. U.S. production that you heard earlier was down to about 5 million barrels a day about 10 years ago. Today, it's very close to 13 million barrels of oil per day. In addition to the Permian Basin, we found some world-class fields, the Eagle Ford, the Bakken, some plays in the Rocky Mountains, and also also Oklahoma. Gas, we have the largest gas field in the world, the Marcellus in northeast U.S. You can see what's happened to all these shale plays over the last decade, the 10 years. This is the oil shale plays, oil production. So you can see the Permian Basin continues to grow, been growing substantially. And I'll talk about the differences. The Bakken and the Eagle Ford are essentially peaked already. I'll talk a little bit about why. The Rocky Mountains is the Niobrara play, and there's another couple plays that have been discovered recently. It has a slight uptick in growth in oil production. The Oklahoma 2 plays there and the Anadarko Basin are on a decline. And it's all about the fact that it's the amount of pay zones, the difference in pay and the number of drilling locations in each of these basins. You can see on that map where all these plays lie in regard to the different colors. The Marcellus is in green. Northeastern, the Permian Basin is in brown, which covers, as I said, about 20-25% New Mexico. These are estimates that the shale production today will peak around 10 million barrels a day. It's now producing about 8. We're producing about 12.5 million barrels a day, as I mentioned. About 8.5 is shale. The rest is conventional and the Gulf of Mexico. So we'll probably climb on up to a little over 10, maybe 10.5 million barrels a day here over the next 2 or 3 years. And the Permian represents the biggest portion of that. On the gas side, what's interesting, there's 2 types of gas production that is produced in this country. There's dry gas and there's associated gas. Associated gas, the natural gas is in the reservoir with the oil, and so it escapes from solution once you have a pressure sink and drill a well in that reservoir, just like open a Coke bottle. The gas escapes from the Coke bottle. When you open a Coke bottle, it's the same type system as when we put a hole in the reservoir down, say 6, 8, 10,000 feet. Gas comes out of solution. So you can see we're producing so much more gas from especially the Permian Basin. It's the second largest gas producer. You think of Permian Basin as an oil producer, but it's the second largest gas producer in the country. We'll talk about some of the issues with that gas later on in the presentation. U.S. natural gas production, you can see the biggest growth has been the Appalachian, the Marcellus, both in Pennsylvania, Ohio, primarily. The growth is continuing, and it represents roughly about 40% of the U.S. total gas production, followed by the Permian Basin. The Haynesville has had a revival. The Haynesville is primarily in northern Louisiana. It's had a revival based on technology over the last 2 to 3 years. You can see the uptick in the Haynesville over the last 3 to 4 years. The difference in all these plays is how much pay. So we're going after the source rock. So what Todd said, his father, what's different is that as a petroleum engineering student at the University of Texas a long time ago, we were taught to go after the sands and the limestones. It's impossible to produce from the source rock. So he basically brought fracking together with going after the source rock, where the oil and gas lies originally millions and millions of years ago. And eventually it escapes from those source rocks and migrates into sandstones and limestones. So let's go after the source rock. And so the Permian Basin happens to have the greatest source rock in the world today. So probably 3,000 to 4,000 feet of source rock, compared to 300 feet in the Eagle Ford, 200 to 300 feet in the Rockies, 200 to 300 feet in the Marcellus. And that's why the Permian Basin has really taken off. Today it's got 25 to 30% of the world's rig activity. So if you haven't been out to Midland and Odessa the last 2 or 3 years, you can't find a hotel room. It's a little bit easier now, and I'll talk about that later, what's happening with the investment community. But it's hard to get into a restaurant. It's been that way for several years. U.S. production growth continued to increase significantly, both on the natural gas side and the oil side over the last decade. And what's amazing to me, I would never have thought this in my lifetime, is that the U.S. passed Russia and Saudi Arabia over the last 12 months. You can see where the red crossed the yellow and also the gray color. So we're at almost 13 million barrels a day. It's estimated we'll probably get on up over time to about 15 million barrels a day and stay fairly flat at that point in time. What's also important is that it was mentioned that I was one of the participants in trying to convince President Obama and both Congress, we had to both have Congress and the President back in 2016 to lift the crude oil export ban. So most people don't realize we could export every other energy commodity. We could export LNG, could export coal, can export gasoline, propane, butane, gasoline, but we could not export crude oil. And it all came back from the Arab embargo that Congress put on place back in the 70s. So they did not want us to export crude oil. And so what happened, we were all of a sudden having a glut of crude oil, and we used to be based off Cushing. The Cushing used to be the benchmark, Cushing, Oklahoma, for the price of WTI, and we were getting $20 less than the price in the international markets. So we compared WTI to the word Brent. Brent is North Sea crude, and so we were getting $20 less. So the industry made a big push to lift the crude oil export ban, and it took us about 2 years to do it. Most people said we couldn't do it, but we had lots of help in that regard. That was lifted in 2016, and so you can imagine the countries wanting our crude, because who wants to continue to import crude from the Middle East or from Russia? So we had Eastern European countries knocking down our door. We had Asian countries knocking down our door wanting our U.S. crude. What's also amazing is that we become a net energy exporter for the first time in 70 years. So we've been importing products more than we're producing for 70 years. So you have to go back 70 years to see where this happened again. This just happened in September. It's happened every month since then, is that we're a net energy exporter. Even though This includes all products. So when you look at oil, we're still importing oil from Canada and from Mexico. None from Venezuela for obvious reasons. But when you look at all products, natural gas, in and out, gasoline, propane, butane, and so on, we become a net energy exporter, which definitely helped on the trade deficit. We're setting records on exports. We exported on crude oil 4.5 million barrels a day in December for 1 week. That's a record. We averaged 2.9 million barrels of oil per day. And you can see in 2016 that solid line that shows when President Obama lifted the crude oil export ban. And you can see it's basically taken off. So we're exporting. Pioneer is one of the leading exporters. We're exporting almost all of our crude either to Asia or to Europe. And the Europeans are wanting it badly, and the Asians are wanting it badly simply because people don't want to be dependent upon the Middle East, especially since what's happened over this past week in Baghdad. LNG exports were discussed earlier, but you can see the amount of LNG. Eventually, in the next 2 to 3 years, will become the world's largest LNG exporter. These are projects under construction, which is amazing. We'll be exporting gas around the world again, to South America, to Asia, and also to Europe. That's liquefied natural gas. So they essentially liquefy the gas, and most of this gas that you saw, the gas production, will be exported around the world. Also, what's happened is that the natural gas boom has displaced coal. That's been good for environmental reasons. It's also good for lower energy prices. So you can see in yellow, natural gas has essentially captured market share away from coal due to the low price. We found too much gas in this country, and it's providing cheap LNG around the world, and it's providing cheap gas for us, for primary electricity in this country. Let's talk a little bit about, you read a lot of articles I've commented on in the Wall Street Journal, is that what's happened. You hear about that our industry is probably one of the worst industries to invest in. And so you can see up until 2014, we pretty much tracked the S&P 500. And so since 2014, this is all majors, E&Ps, and E&Ps are energy or exploration production companies, even though nobody explores anymore in this country. Really, it's all shale. We know where it is. It's all about margins and how to bring it economically. And so you can see what's happened in the stock market in regard to S&P 500. People have been buying tech, Amazon, Netflix, FANG stocks, and so on. And the energy stocks, it happened at the time that we had the crash. So Saudi Arabia made a major decision in late 2014. We were taking market share because 2014 we added 1.5 million barrels a day into the world market. It was all shale. And so Saudi Arabia made the decision to go ahead and put shale out of business. That didn't happen. It actually got better and better. And so because of that, ever since then, we've underperformed the market. Today, the mindset, we used to take every dollar and put back into the ground to drill a new well. Now what's happening, we're only putting about 80 cents of every dollar we get in back into the ground. We could put 100%, but our shareholders in the public side, the private side, do not want us to. We've raised so much money from a debt standpoint and also from a public equity. Markets raised over $200 billion over the last several years to help fuel the shale boom, is that now they want money back. So we're turning into slower growth models, more dividends, and more share buybacks like other industries. And so that's what we hope to bring more investors back into our sector. Pioneer, I matched this over the last decade in regard to the largest shale producers, Concho in the Permian, EOG, Conoco, Oxy, Exxon, Chevron, the two remaining majors in this country. And you can see over the last 10 years that Pioneer about 200% return, but most of the majors 0% return over the last 10 years. A few other shale producers, and if you look at most shale producers, they were probably negative over the last 10 years. This is what's happened with the shale boom. We changed commodity prices. So you can see what's happened to crude. in regard to oil price. Brent and WTI, there's about a $4 to $5 differential between the two, but you can see what's happened to crude in 2014. It dropped back down to about 50. It's right now, Brent is around 68. It moved up about $5 since what happened in Baghdad over the last week. Natural gas, we found way too much natural gas, and you can see it's been a boom for the U.S. consumer from an electricity standpoint, and also for LNG prices around the world. It's lowered the prices around the world for the entire world. The rig count I won't spend much time on, but you see the drop in the rig count that happened in 14. That's because of the price collapse. But then you see the drop that's happened over the last 12 months, even though prices are good today. So normally you would see the rig count in red increase at this point in time. But what's happened, the investors are basically wanting more dividends. They're wanting more buybacks, and they want us not to focus on growth. And so that started happening about 12 months ago, and so that's the reason you see the major reduction in the rig count on the oil side over the last 12 months. I'm not going to spend, these are probably a little bit more technical, but it's just showing that Pioneer is drilling the best wells in regard to all the wells in the Midland Basin and also in the Permian Basin. Full cycle break-evens. You can see the break-evens in the Midland Basin are down in the $45 range for most companies. And let me end with environmental, and then I'll end with the comments I heard Tad talk about fracking ban. What's important is ESG for all of us, all oil and gas companies. Pioneer is 100% focused on it. You'll see a slide in a minute. One of the things that I've been speaking about publicly across the U.S., and we're having with one of the UT Energy Institute and with Columbia Energy Advisors, we're having one of the first largest methane conference to talk about flaring in the Permian Basin and the Bakken at the end of this month down in Austin. But it's important. This natural gas boom has definitely reduced CO2 emissions, but we need to figure out how to reduce the flaring side of the business. We don't connect a horizontal well. So when we bring on a well in the Permian Basin, it's not connected unless we're tied into a gas line. Our problem is you'll see that we don't have enough natural gas lines to get the gas from the Permian Basin to the Gulf Coast and get it exported. So the oil pipelines, they actually overbuilt. We built too many oil pipelines the last 2 years because of the boom. But now we have 8 million barrels a day of capacity moving oil from Permian Basin down to the Gulf Coast. We don't have enough natural gas lines. And the primary reason is that natural gas is so cheap, a lot of producers don't commit their gas down these pipelines. So they go to the Texas or the New Mexico or in North Dakota and get flaring permits. So they get a 6-month flaring permit. They'll go back and get another 6-month flaring permit. And so we're trying to get everybody to adopt the same practices we are. And so what sparked all this, a company called Rystad, it's a think tank group out of Norway. They actually went into the Texas Railroad Commission and went into the New Mexico Commission and actually gathered all this data by operators, see who are the largest flares in the Permian Basin. What's interesting, you have two of the largest majors in the world, Exxon and BP, as your worst flares in the Permian Basin. And so they gathered all this data. They published in the New York Times. It came out in the Wall Street Journal. And so I had started my process. Pioneer is the second lowest. I'm trying to get everybody to focus on getting below 2%. We do things, we do aerial surveys with infrared technology, looking at all of our tank batteries, all of our well sites. We fly them over at least once to twice a year and determine if there's any leaks. We have a policy of not connecting any, like I said, not connecting any oil wells and start producing the oil before you are connected the gas to a gas line. A lot of companies in the Delaware have the policy to start producing the oil because they want to get their economics back. Oil is the economics, and so they just let their natural gas flare. So we got to change our policies among operators. It's one of the things that we're really focused on. So I hate to see articles being written about the Permian Basin being flaring about 1 BCF a day. Recently, I met with the governor, and he was flying back and forth several times with the incident in El Paso, and he said, it looks like New York City, Scott, every time I fly over the Permian Basin going from El Paso back to Austin. And so when you get comments like that, it's something that we have to solve as an industry. The benefits of the two last slides, and we're opening it up for Q&A. Obviously, the benefits of the shale revolution. Number one, energy security. Energy security is what got Congress and President Obama to lift the crude oil export ban. They knew the benefit of us getting on up to about 13 million barrels a day. And we surpassed Russia and Saudi. It helps us negotiate around the world in regard to energy policy and military policy. We've seen natural gas production reach an all-time high. What's amazing, there's been reports out of D.C. by think tank groups and by the administration that we're saving the consumer in the U.S. $200 billion a year. That's lower gasoline prices and lower electricity prices, $200 billion a year. If it wasn't for the fact that we would not have added this 8 million barrels a day and 60 BCF a day of U.S. shale gas. And that's been going on for about 4 or 5 years, so it's up to about $1 trillion and will continue to happen. Also, we've had a petrochemical boom in the Gulf Coast along several states. 200 billion new petrochemical plants. There hadn't been one built in over 30 years in the Gulf Coast. The reason is we got cheap natural gas liquid prices and cheap natural gas prices. Revenue generation, we created another 600,000 jobs in this country. Obviously, we're now an energy superpower. I have to end with what happens. This is a study, since we have at least 2 presidential candidates, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who have come out in regard to a fracking ban. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce just announced this study in the last 30 days. So if this happened, we would lose $1.9 trillion in federal tax money through 2020, mid part of the decade. GDP could drop, $7 trillion. You can see 4 million jobs will be lost. 19 million jobs will be lost by 2025. And what people don't realize, if we stop drilling today in the Permian Basin, we're producing 5 million barrels a day. You hear about the decline rate. The decline rate the first year is 75% of a typical well. And so our corporate decline rate, if we stop investing at Pioneer, it's 35 to 40%. So the Permian Basin would drop about 40% per year in oil production. U.S. would drop about 40% per year. So that 13 million barrels a day would decline roughly 4 to 5 million barrels a day in the first year. So how do you think, where are we going to bring in 4 to 5 million barrels a day? We're going to bring it from Iraq, Iran, Saudi, places we don't want to bring it in. So I think most American consumers don't realize this. And the U.S. will become obviously more dependent upon foreign crude, and we're going to have to continue to send thousands and thousands of troops to the Middle East to protect the oil fields. So I'm going to stop there. We'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent talk. In the last year, I have visited Midland, Odessa twice. Okay, so I've seen everything you're talking about. But my question is a historical nature. Did this just happen? Did we stumble on it, or did we know about it before? Why all of a sudden, boom?
Well, it started with George Mitchell experimenting in the Barnett Shale. So the Barnett Shale is not even considered a reservoir by most people in the industry. And so he was taking what we call a junkie reservoir around Fort Worth, Texas, and experimenting with the source rock. And that's what led to the gas shale boom. And so fracking's been around since 1948. Amoco invented fracking in 1948. Most onshore wells have been fracked in this country since 1948. And so it was really going after the source rock, because I should have brought a piece of the Wolfcamp, which is the main producing formation in the shale play. But you can't even see any holes in it. It's impossible. So how do you get oil out? And you have to break it up. You break it up by fracking. And the fracking we're drilling wells now 2 miles long. And so we used to drill a vertical well And the vertical well in the Permian Basin made 50 barrels of oil per day. Today our wells come in 2,000 barrels a day, and we're fracking along a 2-mile horizontal radius.
I understand that, and that's good. But what I want to know is, the Permian Basin, okay, did we always know that it had such rich resources, or did we just discover it in the last few years? That's what I really
Well,
want.
yeah, initially, most people, if you had asked 10 years ago, they said oil will not produce out of shale. So we proved that gas, it moves more freely, the molecules in shale. It's easier, and that's why it started in the gas place. And so most people at that time, even myself, 10, 12 years ago, it's not going to work in oil because oil it's a heavier molecules, it's not going to move through it. And so people started experimenting in the Permian, the Bakken, and the Eagle Ford all about the same time and realized it worked. So now, you have to look at geologic history. There are other basins as big as the Permian around the world. There's basins, Saudi has so much oil, they don't have to go after the shale. So the shale is still there in Saudi Arabia, it's still there in North Africa. Russia has huge shale potential, but we have the infrastructure. We're the only country in the world where it's free enterprise, where you have the landowners in this country can own the minerals. Every other country in the world, the government owns the minerals, except our country. And so you develop entrepreneurship, independence to create the activity, and that's what's created this boom.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm a nephrologist. I have no expertise in this area at all. So disclaimer to the audience here. My name is Bill Henrich. I'm the president at UT Health San Antonio. And I took a trip this summer from San Antonio to Santa Fe. And I want to applaud what you said about the environmental change attention that you're bringing to that area of the country, because I had not been there for 10 years, and when I traveled there this summer, I was struck by the dramatic change in the landscape to that area of the country, north of the Pecos all the way up to New Mexico. It has had an environmental cost in terms of the beauty of the area and the feel of the area. So whatever you can do to reduce the flaring and to get regulations in place for the lack to decrease the waste would be, I think, applauded by everybody. It's dramatically different than it was. I hadn't seen it for a decade, and as you know well, it's changed dramatically, just the feel of the land. That's a comment. The question is, no one has talked yet about what the reservoir is like. How long can this incredible growth go on? How long can the United States remain energy somewhat independent, as it has enjoyed in the last 5 to 10 years because of this revolution in fracking? So if you'd make some comments about that, I think everybody would be interested in what your forecast is for what the future looks like, say 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now. Thank you.
Yes. First of all, I live part-time in Santa Fe, so I live 3 days a week in Santa Fe, 4 days a week here. So I know exactly. I lived 20 years of my life in Midland, so I know the area that you drove to. So, and my wife and I own a big ranch outside of Santa Fe, so land is very, very important to me and what happens. In regard to the future of this business, the gas is going to be there for a long time. The Marcellus is going to continue to grow. It's going to be there. It's a price issue, why it's slowing down now. So when you have $2 natural gas, very few people will drill. So it's a price issue. On the oil side, the Permian Basin I showed you will last for several more years. So I talk to students at all. We still hire from all the major engineering colleges. I still have to convince students to come into this industry as engineers because I've been studying electric vehicles, for instance, over the last 5 years. And electric vehicles is going to take a long time. They represent 25 to 30 million barrels a day of gasoline. We use 25 to 30 million barrels a day of 100 million barrels a day of a gasoline. So if we convert all gasoline motors to electric vehicles overnight, we would automatically lose 25 to 30 million barrels a day. Now it's going to happen over time, In my opinion, electric vehicles will eventually get to peak oil demand at some point in time. There's studies. Some people say it'll happen in 5 years. Some people say it'll be 20. I think it's more like 15 to 20, but I look at hydrocarbons as a transition to alternative energy. And so we have to keep investing in alternative energy, wind, solar, electric vehicles. Most people don't realize when they buy a Tesla, they plug it into their house. It's 45% natural gas, hydrocarbons, that's charging that Tesla battery. People don't realize that. They think they're going to the environment automatically. But I see us transitioning from hydrocarbons from 1860 when the first well was drilled. It'll probably last for another 50 to 75 years. The Permian Basin started in the 1920s. It'll probably still be there in 50 years from now, but at a much slower pace. So we have to continue to transition to alternative energy in this country. So I hope that helps. Yeah.
Scott, thanks for the excellent presentation. Question is OPEC still relevant? You know, you still read about OPEC increasing, decreasing production, 500,000 barrels a day, et cetera. Sort of what's the role of OPEC in the world today, given that the U.S. has this?
Yeah.
The reason I ask the question is because of the political implications, stability in the Middle East, et cetera. Sort of what's the role of OPEC, given the U.S. role now in large production of oil?
Yes, the OPEC is still substantial, and Saudi Arabia at 10 million barrels a day. What's, to me, the miracle was that if you know Middle East politics, Russia has aligned with most of the Shiite groups, especially Damascus and Syria. Saudi Arabia is Sunni. And so what happened, a miracle that happened about 2 years ago, was that Russia and Saudi came together. They both need higher revenue. Too low of revenue, too low of oil price in those countries destabilizes those countries, and they realize it. So the Crown Prince is trying to figure out how to move Saudi Arabia away from oil prices slowly over time. That's why he took Aramco public recently. That's why they're probably going to do another a secondary public offering in about a year for foreign institutions to come in versus just locals and Middle Eastern institutions. But they want to diversify. But when you look at OPEC and put Russia in there, that's 20 million barrels a day. And you put Kuwait and UAE, you're up to about 28 million barrels a day. So that just those four countries control roughly about 30%. And now they call OPEC NOPEC. So is the term, because Russia and some other countries have joined. So they all realize they can't get the price too high. If we get the price too high, then we're going to go to alternative energy too fast. It'll hurt demand. So they're trying to find the right balance. And the right balance, in my opinion, is around $60, $70, which translate to the gasoline prices $2 to $3 in this country. You saw what happened when gasoline prices gets to $4 to $5. And even though in Europe it's $9 because they got a $7 tax on Europe. California, is the highest priced gasoline in this country simply because 60% of the price of gasoline is a state tax. The federal tax is very, very small. So OPEC is still meaningful. They're smart people. And now what happens in regard to this Iraq-Iran situation, nobody knows. So I was on Brian Sullivan's CNBC yesterday, and I expect a lot more Middle East volatility based on what President Trump did with the assassination. Is that it? Thank you.
One more question.